Beneath the marble floors of the Vatican, beneath centuries of footsteps, prayers, and whispered absolutions, there lies another silence. Not the silence of faith, but of something hidden. Down there, in the cold that feels less like air and more like memory, stands a chamber unmarked on any pilgrim's map. It is not meant to be visited, only guarded. They call it the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticani, the secret archives of the Vatican. But tonight, we do not come to see the scrolls of emperors or the decrees of saints. We have come for the books that were never meant to exist, the ones bound in leather that sweats like living skin, sealed shut with red wax, dark as clotted blood. When the heavy oak door creaks open, it sounds less like hinges and more like breath being drawn. The scent of dust and incense lingers, the fragrance of worship long since turned to ash. Everything here seems to remember, the prayers, the secrets, the sins. Between rows of iron shelves, a single figure moves, an archivist, old and deliberate, his robe faded, his hands trembling slightly under white cotton gloves. He carries a ring of keys that jingle softly, each one rumored to open a door never meant for daylight. At the far end of the corridor stands a smaller gate, its edges engraved with forbidden sigils, Latin glyphs once spoken only by inquisitors and exorcists. He calls it Tabularium Obscura, the archive of darkness, not because it lacks light, but because what it shelters makes light afraid. Within these walls are not just the chronicles of human sin, but the records of humanity, encounters with the inhuman, entities the Church refuses to name but never fully denied. And among the relics and records sits one codex sealed tighter than all the rest, its cover blackened and cracked with age. Pressed into its wax is an unfamiliar sigil, a circle enclosing three nearly erased letters, S.V.C., the Sanctum Vampiricum Codex. No one knows who placed it here. Some say it arrived during the reign of Pope Clement VI, around the time when the Black Death turned Europe into a mass grave. Others claim it predates the papacy itself, copied from lost Byzantine manuscripts debating the resurrection of the body and the corruption of the soul. Whatever its origin, one truth endures. Each time someone has dared to break its seal, the air grows viscous and the cold sharpens, as though the room itself inhales. The archivist places his keys aside. From within his sleeve, he draws a small silver blade, tarnished by centuries of disuse. With a slow breath, he cuts through the crimson wax. The sound it makes is like bone splitting. A shudder of cold passes through the chamber. No wind, but something older, as if memory itself had exhaled. His voice, steady yet reverent, breaks the silence with a phrase in Latin, in nomine veritatis abscondite, in the name of the hidden truth. The pages sigh open. They are brittle, browned, the edges scarred as though scorched by fire. On the first page, ink the color of old blood spells out the title, De Creaturis Tenebrarum, concerning the creatures of the night. Beneath it, a line written in brighter red, Hoc non est fabula. This is not a fable. The warning feels less like a note and more like a curse, because from this moment onward, the words cease to be myth. They become testimony, a secret history written in the trembling hands of priests, saints, and scholars who found themselves staring into something that mocked both death and divinity. The first account begins simply, I, Father Aluin of Transylvania, 1447. His handwriting is frantic, the letters uneven, the ink pressed deep as if carved by fear. He writes of a creature that wears the likeness of man, but whose blood runs not for life, but for covenant. He calls it a blasphemy of the resurrection. A soul trapped in its corpse, animated not by grace, but by hunger. And with those words, the horror crystallizes. The vampire is not a beast, but a theological contradiction, a perversion of resurrectio corporis, the resurrection of the flesh. If something can rise again without the hand of God, what becomes of the promise of salvation? The archivist pauses. He has read this passage countless times, yet it still pulls at his chest like a whisper of guilt. To most of the world, the Vatican is the fortress of light. But here, in its lowest depths, the light exists only to mark the boundary of darkness, to remind the faithful that faith itself has shadows. He turns another page. A dark stain appears on the margin, rusted, ancient, unmistakably blood. Beneath it are more testimonies, reports from bishops, monks, and inquisitors who all describe the same thing in different tongues, a spiritual plague that feeds not on flesh, but on the soul's refusal to die. Some of these accounts are signed with trembling crosses as though the authors doubted whether even their names should touch such words. A phrase repeats throughout the pages, non mortui sed damnati, not the dead but the damned. It is written again and again in different hands in red ink and soot. And in that repetition lies the Vatican's unspoken admission that the war between light and darkness was never symbolic. It was recorded, sealed, and buried. A gust of air stirs the candlelight. For a moment, the flame reveals an ancient mural on the stone wall, a faded angel with a sword raised high, descending upon a creature half human, half shadow. Time has eroded the paint, yet the creature's eyes still glimmer faintly, as though lit from within. The archivist bows his head and murmurs a line from the Gospel of John, Et tenebrae comprehenderunt eam. And the darkness did not overcome it. But in this chamber, those words sound less like triumph and more like defiance. Above, the bells of St. Peter's toll, the hour of midnight prayer. Pilgrims kneel in the basilica, praying for mercy. None of them will ever know what sleeps below their feet. Yet down here, the walls seem to breathe with the burden of those prayers, absorbing them like dust. The archivist knows what most dare not say aloud. Some silences are divine, not because God forbids speech, but because humanity is not ready to hear. He closes the codex, the wax seal now broken, the words once again awake. The candle flickers lower, the scent of burnt tallow mingling with the faint metallic taste of something that feels like fear. And as he leaves the chamber, a single line remains visible on the final page, glowing faintly in the dying light. When blood becomes prayer, salvation demands silence. The staircase is older than the language we use to name it. It curls downward like a fossilized wave, stone-worn satin smooth by souls that never spoke of where they'd been. The archivist moves without hurry, the ring of keys against his palm chiming like a tiny liturgy. Oil lamps in wall niches tremble as we pass, each flame cupped by a halo of breath that isn't ours. The air grows mineral, iron, faintly sweet, the smell of parchment, of ink, of time. Above us, Rome turns in sleep. Beneath us, Rome remembers. The corridor narrows, then opens into a rotunda cut straight from the bedrock, its ceiling scalloped by centuries of chisels patient as prayer. Here the marble gives way to tufa and shadow, and the first set of sigils appears. They are neither ornamental nor merely old. They are instructions written to things that do not read, carved into a lintel of volcanic stone, a cross enclosed by a hexagram, a short line of Latin that has outlived the mouths that formed it, vinculum luxis, non inimicum, a binding for light, not an enemy. The archivist touches the inscription with 2 fingers, not in superstition, but in habit. He speaks so softly the words seem to rise from the wall itself. Custodia verbis, custodia animis. Guard the words, guard the souls. The iron gate beyond is not large, but it is heavy in the way certain truths are heavy. Flecks of candle soot stipple its bars. Behind it, a hallway disappears into a slope whose end you cannot see. He selects a key that looks unremarkable, black iron, teeth filed in a pattern that would confuse any locksmith. The lock receives it with a dry click like teeth meeting after a long fast. The gate yields. The lamps behind us gutter as if unwilling to cross. We continue with one lantern only, the archivist's. He guards its flame with the curl of his body, a posture that resembles love or penance. The hush tightens. Down here, whispers travel differently. They roll along the vault and come back thinner, carrying a question you didn't ask. The floor levels. We enter a chamber shaped like an almond, the ancient symbol of passage and sight. Shelves, stone, not wood, grow from the walls as if the earth itself decided to keep a record. Each shelf holds boxes wrapped in faded linen or leather, bellies of bookworms stitched shut with wax. Labels in brown ink lift and bow as if breathing. De maleficiis, de signis, questiones inusitatae. The archivist's lamp does a slow circuit, and the titles pass like faces in a procession of the unburied. He never looks directly at any single one for long. It is not fear, it is etiquette. He leads me to a side alcove where the temperature falls as though we have stepped into a stored winter. Here, the stones are sharper, the mortar veined with something glinting pale. The alcove ES arch is stitched with 3 seals of lead impressed with the same unknown device, the circle and the ghost of the letters we saw before, SVC. The archivist removes a leather wallet from his sleeve, not much larger than a missal. Inside are slips of vellum the size of a palm, each bearing a short prayer, and a signature in a different hand. He places one slip against each seal and waits. The lead does not move, but the air loosens, and an odor like rain on coins blooms. He nods, satisfied, and produces the key that opens the smallest door I have ever seen in a place built for giants of doctrine. Within, no room, no table, no chair. Only a recess, waist-high, cut into the wall like a reliquary for something that cannot be displayed. On its stone bed rests a black volume banded by a strap of cracked leather. The strap is shut by a clasp that looks like a thorn unbent and taught to obey. The archivist does not touch the clasp yet. He sets the lamp to one side and lets its light travel across the spine. The binding is scaled with the scuffs of many hands that pretended they were not hands. In a corner, stamped deeper than any title, a device resembles a droplet enclosing a crossbar. It could be a printer's mark. It could be a warning. He speaks, not to me, not to himself, but to the work. Lex taciturnitatis, the law of quiet. He explains in the tone of one explaining weather that certain codices are consulted under a rule of silence, broken only by the Latin of citation or the living names of the saints. The point is not secrecy. The point is containment. Words about certain things tend to grow legs. This rule keeps them from walking too far. When he unhooks the clasp, the strap snaps back with a sigh like a door relieved of watch. The codex does not open yet. He rests his palm over it and waits, as if asking for the pulse of a patient he knows too well. Only when the cold steadies under his hand does he lift the cover. It is not the first page that matters in such books, he says, but the inside of the cover, the ghosts of inks long pressed, the indentations of pens that bit too hard. He shows me a blot where a quill must have fallen when someone heard a sound they could not name. There, he whispers, and the lamp reveals a marginal note like a scar. Nolit querere voces, vos inveniant. Do not seek the voices, they will find you. The text within is not a continuous narrative, but a city of entries, testimonies, receipts, exorcism protocols, censured letters, the occasional botanical aside about herbs that thrive only in soil watered with the wrong kinds of prayers. The script changes with each hand, the fear does not. A rubric runs through the margins like a red river, references to things already sealed, to cases closed with a phrase that means nothing and everything, quietus per misericordiam, brought to quiet by mercy. He lays a vellum bookmark, modern, unstained, beside a cluster of leaves that bulge where a packet is pasted between pages. From the packet's flap spills a pinch of ochre powder that stains the stone. The archivist pinches it up with pity. Soil, he says, gathered from a grave that had no right to be warm. The packet bears a date and a city half scraped away, and a word written over the original word in a younger ink, tacit. It is not only the mouths that are silenced in such matters, it is the places. A tremor passes the lamp, halo, when he turns the folio to a section marked by twin threads, one white, one red, looped through the binding like veins. The red thread leads to de sanguine, the white to de terra. Blood and soil. The archivist's thumb hesitates where they cross, and in that hesitation I feel the weight of a doctrine never preached from any pulpit, that certain patterns repeat because someone is drawing them. He does not say this, he does not need to. The Codex says it with its architecture. We do not read yet of faces or names or the whispering thing that promised a priest the eternity he had vowed to decline. That belongs to another section, another hour. For now, this descent is not about monsters, but about methods. How the Church learns to look at what it refuses to see. Catalogue numbers glint in the margins, notations like SVC Tauschtultum 3 ad custodium, a case bracketed for custody, not conclusion. Sketches in iron gall ink reduce terrors to diagrams, a coffin measured in cubits, a thorn branch rendered with the painstaking affection given to relics, a symbol resembling a ladder, barred in its middle, annotated Scala Clausa, a closed descent. We remain in the almond-shaped room long enough for the lamp to enumerate the contours of restraint, the rule that no page from this codex leaves this vault, the rule that the codex is never read alone, the rule that if a reader hears words in a language he does not speak, the session ends. The book is rebanded and the reader spends a night in the chapel above without speaking to any living thing. The archivist recites these not to warn but to remind. They are prayers addressed to procedure, and procedure is the slow armor of frightened men who refuse to run. When we retreat from the recess, the lead seals do not reform. That is not their nature. Yet the air resumes its weight. The lamp brightens slightly, as if relieved that it will not be asked to show more. The archivist closes the small door, replaces the vellum slips in their wallet, and returns the wallet to his sleeve, where it rests like a second pulse. We step back into the rotunda of shelves. Somewhere, a drip begins. It is only water. Down here, even water learns patience. At the threshold, he pauses and looks up at the oculus cut into the rock, the round mouth where a circle of night peers down. His voice finds one more line, simple as air. When you read the dark reads back. He does not attribute it. Perhaps it belongs to him, perhaps to the codex. The iron gate closes with a gravity that feels earned. The key withdraws, the corridor exhales, and we begin the ascent we will later reverse, carrying with us a sentence that will not stop rustling. Blood, soil, soul. Threads that cross again and again in a pattern older than our fear. The first name that appears in the Sanctum Vampiricum Codex is written in trembling ink that has faded to the color of dried rust. Frater Aluin de Transylvania, Anno Domini 1447. The handwriting belongs to a man who knew Latin as prayer, not scholarship. A cleric who wrote because silence had become unbearable. His opening line reads almost like a confession. They rise, but they are not saved. Father Aluin was a minor priest, assigned to a rural parish where superstition still clung to the soil like fog. His letters to the Holy See were never meant for publication. They were reports, written between vigils, each one more desperate than the last. In them, he describes a village beset not by heresy or plague, but by something colder, quieter, and far more patient. The dead had begun to stir, graves were found open, livestock bled dry, and the faces of the living grew pale not from sickness, but from dread, the kind that teaches the soul new ways to tremble. At first, Aluin did what any priest would do. He blessed the graves, he sprinkled holy water on the disturbed soil, invoked the litany of saints, burned incense until the air shimmered. Yet, each dawn brought a new mound overturned, a new body drained white. The villagers whispered of the children of the night, Filii Tenebrarum, a phrase that would appear again and again in Vatican marginalia for centuries. Aluin's problem was not that he didn't believe them, it was that he believed too quickly. His diary tells us he went to one such grave before sunrise, a spade in his hand, a crucifix clenched between his teeth. He wrote of how the earth seemed to resist him, compacted as if breathing beneath. When his blade finally struck wood, he paused to pray, but the words tangled. Inside the coffin lay not rot but preservation. The skin was flushed, the mouth wet, and when he touched the cross to the creature's brow, the flesh hissed as though kissed by steam. It was then, he says, that he understood this was not a corpse at all. It was something waiting. His instinct was exorcism. Yet the right for what he faced did not exist. The church had prayers for souls, for demons, for the diseased and the dying, but not for those who had died and refused to stay so. So he improvised. He read aloud from the book of John the passage of Lazarus, but in reverse order, ending not with resurrection, but with the grave. Come forth became return to dust. He poured salt in the mouth, pressed the crucifix to the heart, and waited. The body convulsed once, then lay still. He left believing he had restored order. But the next evening, another grave stood open, and this time the coffin was empty. The next pages in the codex are blotched, words soaked into each other by damp or by tears. Yet from the fragments, a pattern emerges. The vampire, vampirus, Nosferatu, Lamia, is never singular. It multiplies not by appetite alone, but by imitation, mimicking the miracle of resurrection. Aluin wrote that what he faced was not a creature of the night, but a parody of Christ. It dies and rises again, but without the word, he noted. It lives by hunger alone. For a priest, this was more than horror. It was theological collapse. He began to see meaning where others saw menace. The vampire, he argued, was not an animal, but an error. A soul caught in a false resurrection, trapped between the mercy of heaven and the gravity of the flesh. It was a blasphemous echo of salvation. He called it resurrectio damnata, the damned resurrection. And it terrified him not because it could kill, but because it could feel. He claimed that in the final moments before destruction, a vampire's eyes wept, tears not of repentance, but of recognition. One entry recounts a night of relentless knocking at the chapel door. The villagers had brought a young woman, pale, with the marks upon her neck. Aluin describes her pulse as faint but steady, her breath cold as candle smoke. He baptized her again as though water could rinse away whatever had entered her. But during the ceremony, she began to whisper. Not words, but fragments of prayers, his own, repeated back to him in her voice. When he stopped, she stopped. When he resumed, so did she. It was as if his faith had become a mirror in which something else was learning to pray. The last line of that entry reads, "I have seen a soul trapped within its flesh, aware yet voiceless. It is not evil, it is imprisoned." The Codex pauses here to include a marginal note from a later reader, written in the 17th century, heretical, yet consistent with observed manifestations in Bohemia. The Church, it seems, had quietly compared notes. What Alouin feared was no longer rumor, but precedent. In the next surviving fragment, his tone changes. The careful hand of a cleric becomes the fractured script of a confessor. He writes of dreams in which he cannot tell the dead from the living, where candles burn with black flame and blood drips upward from the altar. He questions whether his prayers are heard or whether they are echoes returning from something that learned his language. By the time the final letter was penned, Alouin had left his parish. The Vatican's records list him as transferred for reasons of health. The Codex tells a different story. It preserves a small, folded slip glued to the page, a fragment of linen, yellowed and brittle. Written across it in his hand are 3 words. Sanguis est oratio. Blood is prayer. The archivist closes the folio slowly. The phrase hangs in the air like a verdict. For Father Alouin, the vampire was not the enemy of God, but the consequence of humanity, a misunderstanding of resurrection, a reflection of faith turned inward until it fed on itself. As the archivist explains, that is why the Church kept his writings, not as evidence of monsters, but as proof of what happens when theology begins to breathe. For the faithful, resurrection is hope. For the damned, it is hunger. Between the two lies only the thickness of a page, and that page still trembles. Up above, the bells of matins begin again. Their echo seeps faintly through stone, like sunlight finding a crack. The archivist blows out the candle. The darkness does not move closer. It waits, as though patient for the next name in the Codex, the next witness to write himself out of light. The next document the archivist turns to is not a diary or confession, but an inquest. Its Latin header, penned in the deliberate hand of a Jesuit scribe, reads, De umbra sanguinis super linteum, concerning the shadow of blood upon the linen. Beneath it, a date, AD 1363. The author identifies himself as Father Valerius of the Society of Jesus, acting under direct commission from Pope Clement XVI. His mission, to investigate a spiritual contagion reported within a monastery in Turin, an abbey renowned for guarding one of Christianity's most sacred relics, the Holy Shroud. From the first line, Valerius writes not like a theologian, but like a surgeon. Faith, he begins, requires precision, for imprecision is the first infection. He describes arriving at the monastery during Lent, when the air smelled of candle wax and fasting. The monks greeted him as if he were a physician come to treat an invisible disease. In their faces, he saw exhaustion, the kind that cannot be cured by rest. 12 monks had perished within a single lunar cycle. Each body was pale, bloodless, and untouched by decay. No wound, no violence, only 2 small marks at the neck, so faint they seemed like the echo of a bite rather than its cause. The abbot, trembling, insisted it was plague, but Valerius, schooled in medicine and mysticism alike, saw no lesions, no buboes, no fever. The bodies were cold, immaculate, as though the life had been drawn out of them by something that understood anatomy better than any man. I found, he wrote, not death, but vacancy. He began his inquiry with the living. The surviving monks spoke in fragments, their voices cracked by sleeplessness. They spoke of whispers in the night, of a visitatio tenebrarum, a visitation of darkness. They heard footsteps on the cloister stones when no one walked. One novice claimed he had seen a figure standing before the shroud, neither shadow nor man, its shape defined only by the absence of candlelight. It spoke without mouth, he said, and promised eternity. The promise was not of heaven, but of unending breath, the imitation of salvation. Valerius took meticulous notes. He observed that the victims shared one trait. They were the most devout, those who spent the longest hours in vigil before the relic. Their deaths were not random, they were ritual. It hunts faith, he concluded. It feeds upon devotion the way others feed upon blood. He spent his nights in the chapel recording temperature, airflow, sound. The air near the altar, he wrote, was colder than stone, though no window stood open. The candle flames bent toward the shroud as if drawn by unseen breath. One evening, he placed a small vial of holy water before the relic. At midnight, the surface began to ripple though no hand touched it. When he examined it by daylight, he found the vial crusted with what looked like crystallized blood. He wrote, "It seeks the blood of faith, not the body. It wishes to turn the holy into its nourishment." The climax of his report, the part written in a hand, shaking so violently that the letters slash across the parchment, records his decision to act as bait. On the final night of his investigation, Valerius dismissed his attendants, sealed the chapel doors, and took the place of the next victim. He describes the setting like a liturgy inverted, the lamps extinguished, the air so cold that frost crept up the wooden pews. He sat before the shroud, crucifix in one hand, a small silver dagger in the other, its hilt engraved with the papal seal. The hour passed slowly. The silence grew so complete that he could hear the beating of his own blood. Then, he says, the darkness itself began to move. It slid down from the rafters like a stain, he wrote. It did not step, it flowed. The figure that emerged was neither spectral nor monstrous. It was beautiful, terribly so. The features were human, but perfect to the point of wrongness, a symmetry that hurt to look upon. Its eyes were pale, cold fire, reflecting the flame it had extinguished. He could not tell whether it spoke or whether his own thoughts had turned against him. The words entered his mind. "You worship life, yet you fear to live forever. I offer you what your God withholds." Valerius wrote that he felt his heartbeat slow, not from terror, but from a strange calm, as if his blood itself had begun to listen. The creature reached for the cross in his hand, not to cast it aside, but to lift it gently, almost reverently, and whisper, "This was my shape once." He thrust the silver dagger into its chest. "No scream," he recorded, "only a breath, the sound of someone relieved to be wounded." The figure recoiled, dissolving into shadow that burst like ink in water. The chapel filled with the odor of iron and myrrh. Valerius collapsed before the shroud. When dawn came, he was found unconscious, the dagger blackened, the floor beneath him marked by a single drop of red that shimmered as though alive. The rest of the report reads like a confession written to silence itself. "I have seen," he writes, "the face of one who remembers heaven but cannot return. It is not beast, but exile. I pray not for victory, but for release." His final line is simple. The eyes, they burn with the cold fire of hell. In the margins, another hand, anonymous, likely a later archivist, adds, "Specimen retained in reliquary vault. Do not disturb. Case resolved per misericordiam. Brought to quiet by mercy." The archivist closes the page and looks at me for the first time. His eyes are neither young nor old. They are the color of candle smoke, church never burned this record, he says softly. It preserved it because it understood the danger of forgetting. To deny darkness is to make it nameless, and the nameless is what returns. He gestures toward the shroud mentioned in the text. Its image, he says, still bears a faint discoloration, no longer visible to the eye, but traceable under the light of certain instruments. A shadow within a shadow, he murmurs. Perhaps only a flaw in the fabric, or perhaps a memory of what once stood before it. The bell of Compline tolls above, low and distant. The archivist lowers his gaze to the codex once more, tracing the scar of ink where Valerius's trembling hand had failed to steady. Then, with the solemnity of a priest closing a mass, he whispers, Deus libere animam eius. May God deliver his soul. Outside the vault, the air seems thinner, the world less certain. Yet in the darkness left behind, one question endures like the scent of extinguished wax. What if salvation itself leaves a shadow? The Codex does not rush to name an enemy. It teaches you to read the battlefield. After Father Alouin's trembling confession and Valerius's clinical ordeal, the parchment shifts tone, as though a different organ of the Church has taken the pen. The ink grows measured, the margins more deliberate, red rubric threading like a vein through careful Latin. Here, the horror becomes doctrine, not to sanctify it, but to strip it of the glamour that makes men bow. 3 words stand in capitals at the head of a folio: sanguis, terra, anima, blood, soil, soul. An inverted trinity, 3 desecrations that mirror 3 promises. The first is sanguis. The scribe begins not with fear, but with the chalice. In the liturgy, blood is not merely symbol, it is participation, the Eucharist as communion with the life poured out once and for all. The Codex is at pains to insist that the vampire hunger is not appetite, but liturgy gone feral, corruptio sanguinis, the corruption of blood. The testimonies we have read begin to align. The women whispering prayers in a borrowed voice, the vial that rippled in the night beside the shroud, the novices who fasted themselves light as paper and were devoured anyway. The scribe writes, it does not drink to live, it drinks to belong. To what he does not say, he does not need to. He calls the bite a counter-sacrament, 2 wounds set like a parody of stigmata, a blasphemous benediction that brands the neck where chrism once traced a cross. The phrase he chooses is baptismus in tenebris, baptism in darkness. He catalogues signs the way a physician lists symptoms. In the hours after attack, the victim feels not terror, but a bright, treacherous clarity, as though a veil had lifted from the world. Colors sharpen, shadows lose teeth, and the heart hears its own ticking as a clock without end. This is consolation, the scribe warns, but not the paraclete. A counterfeit comfort rides the bloodstream, catechizing the body to say yes. The antidote he prescribes is not a weapon but an examination. Lay the host upon the tongue of the wounded and watch whether the consolation curdles into ash. The Codex is firm. Mercy is swifter when discernment is slower, meaning haste to kill is pride. First, test what the blood believes. From blood, the treatise descends to terror. Here the ink turns earth damp, the script itself sinking lower on the page as though burdened by graves. The vampire's insistence on native soil is not a folk quirk to be mocked, but a logic of bonds. Terra ligata, the bound earth. The dead belong to ground consecrated by prayer. Resurrection presumes this covenant. What the vampire enacts is a parody of that belonging, not consecration, but custody, not awaiting the trumpet, but clinging to the prison. Soil becomes anchor, coffin a chapel of refusal. The Codex gathers field notes from inquisitors who found beds of foreign dirt stitched into mattresses, hulls of coffins lined with powder from a homeland the mouth could not pronounce. A man may abandon his city, one writes, but the damned carry it in sacks. The rite the Church develops to answer this is neither axe nor blade, it is naming. The soil must be read aloud, its origin called out like a sin in confession, and then sanctified until it will no longer answer to the creature that sleeps in it. The scribe sets it down like a recipe for unbinding, a ring of holy water, clockwise, a line from the Psalms that unmakes thresholds, a fistful of salt sown into the dirt, while the names of the dead from that homeland are recited. If the vampire wakes before the rite concludes, the Codex advises no pursuit. Force persuades hunger, a margin warns. Holiness persuades chains. In other words, convert the prison before you confront the prisoner. The grave, once rendered untrue, will refuse its tenant. The creature, evicted, becomes itinerant, and the dawn is very far from home. The last, and the weight the pages were always bending toward, is anima. Here the Latin grows sparse, as if embarrassed by what it must say. The vampire's most terrible blasphemy is not its theft of blood, nor its tyranny of soil. It is that the soul remains. Anima vincta, the bound soul. Not displaced by the demon that moves the limbs, not erased by the hunger that moves the teeth, but present, awake, and unable to command. The Codex S testimonies return in a chorus. Aluin S, conviction, that the eyes wept with recognition. Valerius's note that the wound drew a sigh like relief. Signatures from Bohemia, Thrace, Siena, each adding a bead to the rosary of dread. It is a creature of exile, the Jesuit insists. It remembers heaven as ache. This is why the Church refuses the language of hunting except as concession. The word it prefers where possible is liberatio, liberation. The stake that peasants fashion as spear is turned, in the Codex, into a pin, clavus misericordiae, the nail of mercy. Not to slay a heart, but to fasten a body to consecrated earth, long enough for a rite to succeed. The rite itself is printed in a cramped hand like a whisper. Name the animating spirit if it will be named. Forbid it by the three to depart with the soul. Command it to leave the vessel barren as a seed pod after winter. Then, and only then, pierce the breastbone so that wood meets dirt through flesh, core per terram, heart to earth. Burn, not to punish, but because ash moves where flesh clings, and running water will not remember. The refrain returns, quietus per misericordiam, brought to quiet by mercy. It is not romantic. The Codex does not mistake pity for permission. A separate column, in red, records failures, cases where compassion lingered until villages emptied. The counsel is hard as bone. If the soul cannot be loosed, it must be judged. The priest who cannot tell the difference must leave the work to another and keep vigil for the living. Pride here, kill more swiftly than fangs. The archivist reads this section without ornament. His finger does not trace the lines. It rests upon the margin as if touching the shoulder of someone grieving. This is the point, he murmurs, at which the story stops being about monsters. It becomes about us. He does not mean fear. He means the human skill of making sacraments of anything. The way blood becomes prayer in hospitals and wars, the way soil becomes altar in nations and graves, the way souls cling to the shape of their pain because it is the only liturgy they remember. The Codex accuses not superstition, but our tenderness for the wrong infinities. A footnote, nearly lost in the gutter of the binding, offers the only sentence in the section that sounds like comfort. nulla tenebra veritatem devorat. No darkness devours the truth. The phrase is not triumphant, it is patient, the patience of men who have learned to descend slowly with a lamp and come back slower. The archivist closes the folio and lets the lamp breathe. Above, the basilica's stone lung inhales a colder hour. Below, the pages keep their covenant with the hands that wrote them, speak softly, bind precisely, and when you strike, strike as a surgeon. When he returns the codex to its cradle, the air has changed, no warmer, only more honest. In the end, the inverted Trinity is not a taxonomy of powers. It is a catechism of thefts. Blood borrowed as sacrament, soil kept as sanctuary, soul held as hostage. To answer them, the Church does the unfashionable thing. It insists that mercy can be violent when violence is the only mercy left. And somewhere in the vault stone, a memory moves like water, finding its grade, the sense that what was stolen may yet be given back, if hands are steady and names are true. The Codex does not end its theology with Scripture. It goes further back to the era before the crucifix, before Latin, before light. The pages shift tone again, their ink browned with age, the script uneven, copied and recopied across centuries. This section bears a curious subtitle: De Vetustis Noctis Spiritibus, on the ancient spirits of the night. It begins with a simple thesis. The Church did not invent the vampire, it inherited it. The archivist reads slowly, voice subdued, each word rolling off the stone walls like the echo of a forgotten sermon. According to these records, the figure we call vampire was not born in Gothic myth or Christian fear. It was older, rooted in the deep religious soil of civilizations that trembled before the mystery of death. Before the gospel brought the hope of resurrection, the world was filled with restless gods of hunger and shadow. Among the Romans, there were the Strix, nocturnal spirits described as winged women with faces pale as wax, who fed not upon flesh, but the vital breath of sleeping children. The Greeks named them Lamia and Empusa, seductresses who lured the faithful from the temples to feed upon their life force. In the cold forests of the Slavs, villagers told of Upir and Vrikolakas, the bloated revenants who rose from shallow graves after improper burial. The Germans had the Nachtseher, the corpse that consumed itself in the tomb, its chewing heard through the soil. The Codex's anonymous theologian threads these disparate myths together with unsettling ease. All these, he writes, are fragments of a single wound. Humanity, terrified of the final silence, gave shape to its fear. But when Christianity spread across Europe, the priests who preached salvation could not erase those old terrors, so they baptized them. The vampire, he argues, was absorbed into the Christian imagination as an allegory, then reclassified as a demon. The archivist pauses. To convert the world, he says softly, you must first convert its nightmares. In these pages, one sees the early church not as destroyer of paganism, but as its editor. Every region carried its own theology of the dead, and the missionaries, perhaps out of pragmatism, perhaps out of mercy, translated those beliefs into Christian terms. The Roman Strix became a demon noctis. The Lamia was described as a succuba, a temptress of souls. The Upir of the East became a servus tenebrarum, a servant of darkness. Their rites of appeasement, libations of blood, coins placed beneath the tongue, salt circles around the grave, were rewritten as holy rituals. The chalice, the Eucharist, the sprinkling of consecrated salt. The language changed, the hunger did not. In one chilling passage, a missionary in the 10th century writes from what is now Hungary. The people speak of the night feeder. I told them it was a devil. They were relieved, for a devil can be exorcised. The Codex notes this shift as deliberate. The Church gave the people a name for their fear, and in doing so claimed the right to confront it. But in doing so, something older slipped through the door of theology, the idea that evil can take shape, walk among us, and mimic divinity. The Codex calls this the Great Inheritance. Before the cross, men feared the dead. After the cross, they feared that the dead still prayed. As the archivist turns the page, the handwriting changes again, smaller, more hurried, perhaps the work of a monk compiling folklore. A list follows, ancient names scratched as though for remembrance. Strigoi, Moroi, Lamashtu, Baoban Sith, Vitala, Jiangshi. The footnote reads, different tongues, same appetite. It goes on to describe how early priests arriving in pagan villages found rituals already prepared for confronting the undead. The Church did not forbid these immediately. Instead, it revised them. The staking of the corpse became a symbolic crucifixion. The burning of the dead became purification by fire. The local charms of iron and ash were replaced by relics of saints. Thus, the author writes, did the cross consume the fang? But there is a line that chills even the archivist as he reads aloud. Yet by naming them, we kept them alive. The Codex warns that the act of translation, of baptizing terror into theology, granted the old spirits a kind of endurance. To deny them was to erase the language of protection that once restrained them. To sanctify them was to invite them into the liturgy, and so they changed shape. The vampire ceased to be a wild god and became a fallen soul, a perversion the Church could recognize, categorize, and fight. The text cites examples of syncretism. In rural France, where the Drac, a water demon, was believed to drown sinners, the Church built a chapel and renamed it Saint Draconis, the dragon saint, whose legend guarded the living from the thirsting dead. In the Balkans, a festival once honoring the goddess Marana, queen of winter and death, was rebranded as the Feast of Saint Marina, protector against plague. Yet behind each new saint's name, the same fear lingered, the fear of spirits who refused to stay buried. The Codex then turns from history to introspection. The Church fought demons, the author admits, but inherited the vocabulary of darkness. A margin annotation, written centuries later in a finer hand, adds, perhaps this is providence, that faith speaks all dialects, even those of fear. The archivist smiles faintly, a tired scholar's smile. This, he says, is the Vatican's genius and its curse. It never destroys completely, it converts, and in converting, it preserves. He closes the page with care. The lamp flickers against the vaulted ceiling, throwing shapes that resemble wings. Every shadow we conquer, he continues, we add to our collection, and in this way, even darkness becomes catechism. As the bell of Terce tolls faintly above, the air in the archive shifts, less like sound than vibration, as though the stones themselves remember. The archivist's voice drops to a whisper. Do you see it now? The vampire was never merely a myth, it was a language the Church learned to speak fluently until it could no longer tell where prayer ended and fear began. He looks back at the Codex, fingers trembling slightly over the names of dead gods transcribed into Holy Latin. They called it heresy once, he says, to believe that old spirits survive within our faith. But tell me, what is the Eucharist if not the transformation of one death into another form of life? The candle gutters. In that fading light, the archivist's last words dissolve into the silence of centuries. Perhaps the vampire was never expelled, perhaps it was converted. The Codex turns brittle here, the pages thinned by hands that consulted them often, priests, inquisitors, perhaps even popes. The script is tighter, professional, confident. Its title reads De Conversione Tenebrarum in Doctrinam, on the conversion of darkness into doctrine. This is the moment when the vampire stops being a creature and becomes a tool, a shape the church could wield. The archivist's voice lowers as he reads. The fathers of the early church, the text begins, understood that the imagination of the people cannot be exorcised by decree. The demon that lives in story must be baptized in story. The Vatican did not merely suppress the vampire myth, it repurposed it. Fear, once pagan, became pastoral. The Codex outlines this process in 3 stages, each both clever and cruel. Assimilation, sanctification, weaponization, assimilation. The first step was acknowledgement. The church accepted that the villagers' night terrors were real, not as physical beasts, but as manifestations of sin and heresy. A bishop's circular from the 9th century reads, "Let no man laugh at the tales of the restless dead, for laughter invites the same unrest." The church found use in the local dread. It taught that those who died excommunicate, unshriven or defiant, might wander after death, drinking life from the innocent. Thus, vampirism became a parable, a moral warning against dying in sin. The grave that failed to rest was the soul that refused repentance. Fear the corruption of the blood, one homily urged, for sin too is contagious. Sanctification. Having absorbed the fear, the church blessed its cure. The Codex lists rituals, the sprinkling of holy water at crossroads, the planting of crosses upon graves, the insertion of Eucharistic wafers into the mouths of the dead. These were not inventions, but conversions of older folk customs, the iron nails, the garlic, the stones on the chest, reborn as Christian rites. Where the pagan drove stakes, the text notes, the Christian places sacraments. But the most daring transformation was theological. In the sermons of the 11th and 12th centuries, priests began to equate the vampire's thirst with spiritual longing, the soul's hunger misdirected. "The devil," said one Dominican preacher, "feeds upon the blood of faith. He will leave you pale, obedient, and empty." The vampire became an emblem of temptation, a warning that desire without grace consumes rather than redeems. It was genius. The people no longer feared monsters in the dark, they feared the darkness in themselves. Weaponization. The third and final step came with the rise of the Inquisition. Once the vampire was defined as daemon incarnatus, a demon clothed in human flesh, it became something that could justify investigation, trial, and execution. The Codex describes how entire communities were cleansed under suspicion of blood heresy. Not all were guilty of feeding on life, some merely defied the Church's authority. "Better to burn one false immortal," the text quotes grimly, "than to let the disease of defiance spread." The archivist stops reading, his eyes linger on that line. "You see," he murmurs, "the Church discovered that the vampire was not only an enemy, it was a metaphor." By equating rebellion with undeath, the Church could turn superstition into law. Heretics were those who refused the true death of surrender to God's order. The inquisitors called them viventes damnati, the living damned, and when they burned them, they called the fire purificatio sanguinis, the purification of blood. The Codex does not flinch from its own complicity. A later annotation, dated 1627, written in the weary Latin of self-awareness, adds, "Sic factum est, timor factus est ministerium." So it came to pass. Fear became ministry. The archivist's lantern trembles as he turns the page. On the next folio, a new voice appears, perhaps a monk scribe troubled by the logic he was recording. "We made symbols of their screams," he writes. "We clothed cruelty in the vestments of ritual." He asks, almost pleading, "If the vampire is the soul that cannot die, what then are we who cannot stop killing?" The ink trails off mid-sentence, as though interrupted. Then comes an unexpected insertion, a letter folded and sewn into the binding. Its edges are burned, but enough remains to read. It is addressed to Cardinal Benedictus of the Holy Office and signed only Frater E. It reads, "We hunt them by daylight, yet they fear only the absence of it. Have we not become what we claim to destroy? For every heretic we burn, another rises pale with the smoke of our mercy. I no longer know whose hunger this is, ours or theirs." The archivist says nothing for a long while. The only sound is the faint rasp of parchment against his gloves. "Some truths," he finally says, "the Church wrote down because it feared forgetting. Others, it wrote down because it could not bear remembering." He turns one last page. The section concludes with a short paragraph in red ink, a doctrinal summation. "When man fears the night, faith must name the night. When faith names the night, it inherits it. When it inherits it, it must govern it." Below it, a single signature, faded but legible, Innocentius III. The archivist exhales as if the name itself carries weight. "One of our most powerful popes," he says softly, "and one of our most frightened." He closes the codex halfway, letting the candlelight pool in its spine. Do you see the pattern? The Church has always known that to rule the imagination is to rule belief. It does not destroy its monsters, it canonizes them. He leans back, eyes half in shadow. "So when you hear of exorcisms, relics, saints who drive out demons, remember that each of them is a translation of something older, darker, and more desperate. We fear what we cannot define, so we give it liturgy. And by the time the prayer is finished, it belongs to us." He looks back toward the sealed shelves, where the air hums faintly with centuries of confinement. "But perhaps," he adds, "some prayers never stop feeding. The codex grows colder here." The ink sharpens into precision as though the scribe himself feared what he was describing and sought refuge in taxonomy. The page begins with a heading written in scarlet, "De Armamentario Tenebrarum," on the arsenal of darkness. Beneath it, in smaller hand, a warning. "To understand is peril, but ignorance is possession." The archivist adjusts his lamp. "This section," he murmurs, "was not written for scholars. It was written for soldiers." Indeed, the tone is different, no longer theological, but strategic. The Church had by this point accepted that the vampire was neither myth nor metaphor. It was, in their eyes, an adversary to be catalogued, studied, and, where possible, destroyed. But the document insists that one cannot fight what one does not comprehend. To confront the darkness, it says, one must learn its grammar. The first entry is titled Vox Diaboli, the devil's voice. It describes the vampire's primary weapon not as fang or claw, but word. Its speech, the codex warns, is thought. The creature's voice bypasses the ear and blossoms directly within the mind. Those who hear it are not compelled. They are persuaded. It speaks in one's own language, using one's own memories, bending devotion until faith becomes obedience. The records from inquisitors in Wallachia describe entire villages lulled into surrender, not by fear, but by a voice that promised peace. They welcomed their undoing as communion, one account laments. The Church attempted to measure the effect. In one grim experiment, 3 priests were each exposed to the creature's presence in controlled conditions. a chamber sanctified by relics and lined with consecrated salt. Within minutes, all three reported the same sensation: warmth, familiarity, love. One began to pray aloud, another began to weep. Only the third, who had been deaf since birth, remained untouched. In the margin, someone had scrawled, "The devil's music plays on memory, not air." Next comes metamorphosis, the illusion of change. The Codex dismisses popular folklore of bats and wolves as superstition, yet insists that the vampire's power to appear otherwise is real. It cannot become mist, the author writes, but it can convince the eye that mist is form. The effect is not physical but psychic, a projection imposed upon the minds of witnesses. The glamour, it explains, is a sermon in shadow. Each man sees the shape of his fear. One 15th century field report quoted in the text describes how an inquisitor's torch revealed nothing, yet his squire swore he saw a black-winged creature crouched upon the altar. Both men died that night, one of heart failure, the other by his own hand. In crimson ink, the annotator writes, "Fear and faith share the same aperture." The only defense prescribed was paradoxical, to disbelieve completely or to believe perfectly. Anything between invited annihilation. The third entry concerns celeritas et fortitudo, speed and strength. The Codex treats these not as supernatural gifts, but as symptoms of an unnatural equilibrium. The vampire, it says, exists in a state of perpetual tension between decay and vitality, death and desire. The flesh does not heal because it is alive, it heals because it is denied death. It is not immortal, the Codex explains, but continually dying, endlessly repaired. This paradox makes it nearly impervious to conventional wounds. Steel severs flesh, but the rent closes as if stitched by invisible thread. Only sanctified matter, objects bearing the memory of sacrifice, can pierce the boundary between life and unlife. The Church's solution was not brute force but ritual. A stake of ash or aspen, carved while reciting the Miserere, became more than wood. It became a conduit of intention. Matter remembers the voice that shaped it, the Codex notes. Thus, a weapon prayed into existence wounds what prayer has abandoned. Then comes Dominium Bestiarum, the command of beasts. Rats, wolves, ravens, even insects. The vampire's dominion is said to extend over the lesser creatures of creation. But the Codex rejects the folkloric image of a beastmaster. It sees a deeper, more insidious logic. The vampire, it writes, does not command, it resonates. Animals sense the fracture between life and death and are drawn to it, as moths to heat, as carrion to flame. Their obedience is not imposed, it is instinctive. Creation, the text concludes, still mourns the one who will not die. A marginal comment by a later reader, perhaps a scientist in cassock, disguise, speculates that this resonance is not spiritual but vibrational, a field of longing that emanates from the creature's very presence. Whatever its cause, the Church responded with the blessing of animals. Cats in monasteries, dogs in churches, birds in cloisters, all reimagined as living senses, creatures of innocence that could perceive what men denied. Hence the ancient phrase Felis Sanctus, the holy cat, etched into more than one convent ledger. The Codex's tone darkens in its next paragraph. Yet the gravest power of the vampire is not what it does, but what it undoes. It lists phenomena observed near prolonged infestations, mirrors that no longer reflect light, crucifixes that rust, relics that lose their scent of sanctity. The theologian interprets these not as chemical curiosities, but as spiritual corrosion. Its presence, he writes, dismantles hierarchy. It makes holy things remember they are only matter. This is the true contagion, the metaphysical entropy that the Church feared above all. It is the unmaking of order, the collapse of distinction between blessed and profane. Where the vampire dwells, the Codex warns, faith becomes anecdote. The archivist closes his eyes for a moment, whispering almost to himself. Entropy of belief, he says. That was always the deeper war. He turns the page, a final entry, brief but ominous, titled simply Umbra Fidei, the shadow of faith. It states that prolonged contact with the vampire can invert devotion. Priests sent to exorcise them sometimes returned, changed. They spoke of illumination, claimed that the creature's hunger was divine, a reminder that existence itself feeds upon sacrifice. One cannot serve both God and the abyss, the Codex laments, yet some will always mistake the abyss for God. The paragraph ends with an excommunication formula, stark and absolute. Let the one who calls darkness holy be cast into the silence between heartbeats. Then a softer line, scribbled later in the margin, but if he weeps, may he still be saved. The archivist lets that sentence hang in the stale air. Even here, he says, mercy sneaks in. The Church could define damnation, but it never stopped hoping for redemption. He closes the folio. The lamplight bends against the polished edge of the Codex, scattering crimson reflections across the stone wall, tiny, fleeting glimmers like sparks in the dark. Every power they feared, he murmurs, was a reflection of their own. Persuasion, transformation, endurance, dominion. The vampire was not the shadow of God, it was the shadow of man. He sets the lamp down beside the parchment, voice lowering to a confessional hush. And perhaps, he adds, that is why it cannot die. The pages that follow are darker, literally so. The ink here has soaked deep into the parchment, leaving a faint sheen like oil. The script has shifted again, smaller, tighter, almost afraid of its own content. The title reads, Rituale Deliberatum, Liberatio Animae per Misericordiam, the ritual of deliberation, the liberation of the soul through mercy. It is written in the Latin of clerics who have seen too much and hope their precision will keep them sane. The archivist warns in a low tone before reading. This was never meant to be recited aloud. It was copied from the Rituale Romanum and then altered. It's part exorcism, part autopsy, part absolution. He pauses, his fingertips tracing the line of the first sentence. To unmake the living dead, one must address the living soul. The ritual begins with identification, an act more spiritual than forensic. The Inquisitor Sanctorum, chosen by the Vatican's inner circle, was not merely a priest, but a theologian trained to detect false life. The Codex insists that no blade may strike before belief confirms. The presence of the undead must be discerned through signs both seen and unseen, the mirrored absence. Where reflection fails, the smell of cold iron in the air, the drop in temperature within a circle of prayer. But the most certain mark, it says, lies in the silence that follows the name of Christ. The vampire cannot answer it, not with voice, not even with thought. Once confirmed, the rite proceeds at dawn. Night feeds it, the scribe writes. Light dismembers it. Yet the ritual is not one of mere destruction. It is a surgery of salvation. The Inquisitor must not hate. The Codex repeats this command 3 times, as though even the paper itself doubts men's capacity for such restraint. To hate the damned, it warns here, is to mirror them. The Church's appointed team consisted of no more than 3 souls. The Inquisitor, who led the prayers and delivered the command. The Acolyte, who carried relics and bore witness. The silent brother, whose sole task was to record and to speak no word until the rite was done. The scene it describes feels more like a battlefield than a chapel. The grave of the afflicted is uncovered. The ground is sprinkled with salt and holy water. Incense clouds the air. A crucifix is planted upright in the soil. Then begins the first movement, Sanctificatio Loci, the sanctification of place. The inquisitor circles the grave thrice, chanting the litany of the saints. The text warns, "Do not hasten, the dead are patient." Next comes Evocatio, the calling forth. The corpse, often unnaturally preserved, is addressed by name. Every creature, the Codex notes, even the damned, still remembers its baptism. The priest commands the demon within to reveal itself using the formula, "In nomine Dei vivi ostende nomen tuum." In the name of the living God, show your name. If the name is given, it is written on a strip of parchment and placed beneath the corpse's tongue. If no name comes, the silence is taken as the creature's final defiance. What follows is contemptio tenebrarum, the defiance of darkness. The inquisitor kneels, touching the stake to the soil, and recites, "As wood pierced flesh upon the cross, so may this wood fasten corruption to the earth." At this moment, the Codex says, the body will resist. Movements, whispers, even mockeries of the dead's former voice are expected. Pay no heed to the imitation of repentance, it cautions. Demons confess only to preserve themselves. Then comes the liberation proper, the most sacred and dangerous act. The inquisitor, with the acolyte's aid, drives the stake of aspen through the heart, not as execution, but as tether. It is meant to pin the spirit to the earth, holding it still long enough for prayer to reach it. The Codex likens the sound to thunder beneath the ground. The instant the stake pierces, the priest begins the major exorcism, invoking the Trinity over and over until the voice that answers fades. The text describes a moment of reversal, a sudden heat that floods the grave, followed by a wind that smells of myrrh and iron. If you have done rightly, it says, the body will sigh, as if exhaling for the first time since its sin. The silence that follows is the sign of mercy. If instead a shriek is heard, a cry that feels like it came from inside your own lungs, then the rite has failed. The soul is lost, and the place must be sealed forever. The last step is purificatio, the purification of matter. The heart is removed, burned upon a bed of consecrated salt. The ashes are scattered into running water. The remaining body is decapitated, its head turned toward the east, symbol of resurrection. Then the priest prays one final phrase, written in both Latin and Greek. Soma lithron, psyche litrosis. The body dissolved, the soul released. But the Codex's final lines betray something that feels more human than holy. They are not instruction. They are confession. Each time the stake fell, I prayed that I would be wrong. For if such creatures live, then salvation is fragile. Yet I have seen mercy even in their eyes, as if they longed for our prayers. Perhaps the Lord hides his pity in their torment, and we, striking them, are the instruments of his grief. The archivist's voice falters. He sets the page down and exhales. The Vatican never called it a killing, he says softly. They called it a release, a sacred euthanasia for the damned. He points to the final annotation, scribbled centuries later by an anonymous scholar. It is not a war, it is triage. Silence swells between the shelves. The lamp flame wavers, caught by a draught that feels colder than air. Somewhere above, the cathedral bells toll faintly, the sound descending like a benediction. The archivist closes the folio with both hands reverently as if sealing a wound. "They said it was a ritual," he murmurs, "but perhaps it was always a confession, the church asking forgiveness for what it had to become in order to protect the living." He glances toward the sealed vault at the far end of the corridor, where the older codices sleep in darkness. "What they hunted," he says, "was never just the undead. It was the shadow their own mercy cast." For a moment, the lamp flickers out. The air tastes faintly of salt and ash. Then in the dark, a whisper. "Quietus per misericordiam." Brought to quiet by mercy. There is a point in every descent when precision exhausts itself and wonder begins. We have measured the silence, named the soil, weighed the blood, and rehearsed the rite that pins a paradox to earth long enough for mercy to find it. Yet the Codex refuses a triumphal ending. Its last pages in this folio do not celebrate victory. They consider the vocabulary that victory requires. Each entry has pressed upon us the same unease. What we call a monster is too often a mirror polished by fear. The Church learned to baptize the dark. In doing so, it learned to speak its dialect. And when you speak a tongue long enough, some of its grammar takes root in you. The archivist closes his eyes and recites from memory, not Latin, but something spare and modern, written by a hand that ran out of ink before it ran out of doubt. If a soul can be trapped in a body that will not die, then theology must learn to breathe underwater. He smiles without pleasure. "That line cost someone a night of sleep," he says, and opens the book again to show a margin where fingernails have dented the fibers. Even skepticism leaves stigmata. We ascend in thought, if not yet in stare. Above us, the basilica remains, beating like a marble heart. Below us, the Codex continues, its arteries branching into cases and cautions. Somewhere between, a question paces the corridor like an animal that knows it is not allowed in the nave. What if salvation is not a gate, but a gradient? The vampire literature insists on borders, consecrated ground, unholy soil, the light that loosens, the dark that binds. But every testimony we have read smudges those borders, the tears in eyes that cannot repent, the sigh that accompanies the stake, the priest whose compassion unties the knot his doctrine tied. It is uncomfortable to admit that mercy has a different texture when it touches something that looks like us. The Church in these pages shows a rare candor about its own temptations. Not the temptations of blood or power, those are easy to deplore, but the temptation to simplify what is complex in order to act faster. The Codex's red rubrics. It's do this, not that, beat like a metronome for frightened courage. But between those lines, in the cramped, honest script of field hands, a different rhythm asserts itself. The hesitation before hammer, the prayer that the failure of the rite will reveal that the premise was false, that the world is tidier than the vault suggests. "I have twice delayed, and twice it cost lives," one hand confesses. "I have once hurried, and I fear I killed a man who was already asking for release." The sum of those sentences is not despair. It is reverence, the reverence that grows when you finally admit you are performing delicate surgery with blunt tools. If the vampire is an inverted sacrament, then our responses invert as well. We call a weapon a nail of mercy. We call a pinning a prayer. Words bend under the weight of what they must lift. The archivist does not flinch from that linguistic violence. Liturgy, he says, was always carpentry. Every creed is a joint that holds against stress. This too is a philosophy the Codex teaches. The truth is not fragile because questions threaten it. Truth is fragile because love does. We love a story clean. The world prefers palimpsest. Consider how the triptych we traced, blood, soil, soul, maps not merely an enemy, but a life. Blood is belonging, soil is place, soul is memory. The vampire corrupts each, belonging without covenant, place without pilgrimage, memory without surrender. Yet the Church counters not with erasure, but with repair. The rite sanctifies soil because place matters. It tests the host because belonging should be chosen. It prays in the grave because memory deserves escort. If there is philosophy here, it is this: what is holy is not what avoids the world, but what refuses to abandon it, even when the world refuses to be healed. The Codex dares a sentence that feels like blasphemy until it begins to sound like hope. God wastes nothing, not even corruption. Every report of release implies a divine economy in which even a false resurrection becomes the site of a true one, not by preserving the counterfeit, but by rescuing the prisoner the counterfeit holds. Our horror is not misplaced, it is untaught. We fear the spectacle more than the captivity. We strike at the shadow and forget the chained thing inside it. That is why the ritual insists on names. To call someone by the name given at baptism is to insist that beneath the mask of hunger lies an identity the hunger cannot digest. The archivist rests his palm on the parchment and talks for once about himself. Not confessional details, those belong to living rooms and to God, but about the craft of custody. When I was younger, he says, I believed these pages proved our enemies were simple. Then I spent a decade watching good men grow dangerous because they loved clarity more than people. He gestures to the regulations the Codex repeats like commandments. Read together, never alone. Stop if you hear a language you do not speak. Sleep in the chapel after you close the book. They are not only protocols for handling a cursed text. They are counsel for any vocation that touches the sacred. Keep company, admit ignorance, return to prayer. Perhaps that is why the philosophy of this section feels less like a treatise and more like a homily whispered to someone who has seen too much. The archivist reads a passage in which an unknown monk, probably of the late 1500s, poses a devastatingly simple query. If we are right to free the soul by striking the heart, how shall we free our own souls from the memory of striking? The answer is not elaborate. It is a schedule. Fast on Fridays, confess what you did, without euphemism. Pray for those you pinned. Ask to be pinned if ever your ministry outlives your mercy. The Codex never calls this penance. It calls it calibration. We pause on a line that looks like a smudge until the light catches it. It is a paradox presented like a proverb. The one who loves light must learn its weight. The Church in these pages is not naive about its calling. It knows that to name evil is to risk enthroning it in language. To fight it is to risk becoming its liturgy. And yet the alternative is worse. To abdicate, to let the unburied keep their courts under the altar. Philosophy here is not an escape from action. It is the bridle that lets action carry a rider instead of running feral. Outside the vault, morning thickens. The bells above ring a note closer to blue than black. It is the hour when the city stirs and the sleepers who prayed for protection forget they ever asked. Down here, forgetting is not a luxury. The Codex hoards memory like a miser, not because memory is pleasant, but because without it we repeat our cruelties in better Latin. That too is part of the closure it offers, the admission that endings are not solutions, they are rehearsals for the next beginning. You close the book, you open your hands, you go upstairs, you live gently with ordinary hunger, and pray it never learns theology. The archivist returns the folio to its cradle. He stands still long enough for the lamp to become the only movement in the room. When people ask me whether the vampire is real, he says, at last, I answer a different question. I tell them I have seen what happens when a soul forgets how to die well. Then I ask whether they want me to open the book. Some do, most do not. Both answers are forms of piety. We will climb the stair soon. We will breathe warmer air and pretend that marble is enough to keep the old night out. But before we go, the archivist asks me to read the final rubric aloud because the voice of the stranger is sometimes the one truth trusts. I speak the words, and they assemble themselves in the space as if they were used to this room. No darkness devours the truth, but truth without mercy is a wound that never closes. My voice disappears into the stone. The lamp lowers. The codex sleeps. Above us, sunlight begins to rinse the statues outside, leaving them pale and innocent again. Below us, a theology that learned to breathe underwater waits for the next reader. Closure, the vault teaches, is not a lot. It is a benediction offered to those who must continue and a warning to keep their hands steady. The archivist opens another compartment of the codex, a separate folio bound in darker leather, scarred by the years, its clasp shaped like a miniature cross. On its spine, in worn Latin, a phrase reads, Instrumenta Fietatis, the instruments of piety. He explains that this section is not about theology but logistics, the material countermeasures the Church devised for a war it never admitted was real. Faith, he murmurs, was never meant to draw blood, but there are times when belief needs hands. Inside, the handwriting shifts again. This scribe writes like an engineer, not a priest. The margins are dense with measurements and chemical recipes, the Latin clipped and practical. These are the field notes of exorcists, inquisitors, and occult scholars who became, unwillingly, artisans of sacred violence. The first item listed is Crucifixa Penitens, the penitent's cross. The Codex describes it not as a weapon but a compass carved of olive wood soaked in brine and oil of nard. Its shape was slightly asymmetrical, the upper beam shortened to resemble a key rather than a cross. The scribe insists it must never be held upright in arrogance, but pointed downward toward the ground, where the dead wait to be redeemed. He notes that the vampire does not fear the cross itself, but what the cross remembers. It is not geometry, he writes, but memory that burns. The archivist glances up. That is why replicas fail, he explains. The symbol without witness is only decoration. Next comes Speculum Argenti Verum, the true silver mirror. Contrary to legend, the mirror was not meant to reveal monsters, but to reveal the absence of grace. The Codex states, in reflection, the consecrated silver remembers light as obedience. What does not obey is not shown. The mirror's surface was polished with ash and vinegar, while psalms were whispered in reverse, a practice so controversial that later church censors condemned it as ambiguous sanctity. A note added by a 16th century Jesuit warns that the mirror, if used carelessly, might also fail to show the viewer themselves. Faith, he warns, must not seek proof it cannot bear. Then there is the Ampulla Sanguinis Christi, a small vial meant to hold a fragment of sanctified wine from the Eucharist. The Codex claims that droplets of this liquid, when flung upon corrupted soil, will awaken the memory of sacrifice and purify the ground. But the scribe adds an unsettling detail. After use, the vial must be buried, never refilled. The blood remembers, he writes. Once it has spoken, it should not speak again. The next implement, Ferrum Benedictum, blessed iron, bridges superstition and sacrament. The Church, reluctantly borrowing from pagan practice, blessed nails and blades under the invocation of Saint Michael. The iron was said to wound both body and spirit when shaped in silence by a fasting blacksmith. The Codex warns, however, that the wielder's intention must remain pure. A hand filled with wrath dulls holiness, the text notes. The metal listens. Further on, we find the Rosarium Luminis, the Rosary of Light. It was not merely beads for prayer, but an instrument of mapping. Each bead was carved from bone mixed with beeswax and resin, consecrated to emit faint luminescence when demonic energy was near. The Vatican dismissed it as pious legend, yet reports persist that exorcists used them to trace invisible boundaries where corruption lingered. The Codex calls it a rosary that prays back. The archivist runs his thumb over the diagram drawn beside the text, a spiral of beads glowing like stars. "You can see the mind of the medieval church here," he whispers. "They did not yet separate science from sanctity. To them, alchemy was theology written in the language of elements." Then the script grows smaller, as though the writer feared being overheard. "Reliquiae mortui sancti," the relics of the dead saints. The Codex lists bones, shrouds, and fragments of martyr blood as potent deterrents capable of driving away entities of corruption. Yet it also carries a warning. Use them sparingly. A relic remembers pain, and if summoned too often, it recalls the pain more than the purpose. The archivist looks up with a shadow of sadness. "Faith can wear itself thin," he says. "Even sanctity repeated becomes fatigue." In the margins, in a cramped 17th century hand, someone has added notes from what appears to be an internal Vatican experiment. It details the use of relics in controlled hauntings, sites deliberately left unblessed, to study the effects of holy intervention. The results are ambiguous. Some relics flared with heat and were consumed. Others grew cold as marble. One reliquary screamed when opened. The note ends with a single Latin phrase: "Nemo tentat Deum impune." No one tests God without consequence. The last object listed is the most mysterious. The Codex calls it Vas Quietis, the vessel of stillness. Its illustration shows a small urn sealed with wax and inscribed with the words "Sit Lux in Memoria." The text explains little, only that it is used when destruction is forbidden and forgetting is a mercy. The vessel was placed near the remains of entities deemed too holy or too tragic to be burned. Inside it, psalms were whispered until the air itself was considered sanctified, a tomb of breath. "In these urns," the scribe writes, "sleep the names we dare not pronounce." The archivist lingers over that line. "Even in war," he says softly, "the church understood that some things are not to be slain, only silenced." He turns to the final paragraph, written not by the original scribe, but by a later reader, perhaps centuries afterward. "These implements are not weapons but witnesses. They testify that faith once trembled, yet did not retreat. Let the modern scholar mock them, still they hold more humility than all our science, for they remind us that belief, like fire, survives only if tended and consumes whatever tends it." He closes the folio gently, almost lovingly, and lets the silence stretch. The lamplight glints off the iron clasp like a spark from another age. "The church," he finally says, "built no armory of steel. Its true arsenal was remembrance, objects made sacred by suffering, by patience, by human fear, turned toward prayer." Perhaps that's what holiness always was, not perfection, but persistence. His words hang in the vault's heavy air. Around us, the relics seem to breathe, a chorus of sleeping tools born of desperation, yet kept alive by devotion. And somewhere behind that silence, perhaps in the pages still sealed by wax, lies the truth that faith and fear were never enemies at all, only two hands of the same trembling body reaching toward the same unknowable light. The archivist's lamp trembles slightly as he opens the next vault ledger, thicker, heavier, bound in calfskin so dark it looks like stone. Its cover bears no title, only a single sigil pressed in wax, a cross entwined with a sword, its hilt inverted. He hesitates, then whispers, "This one was not meant for theologians. It was meant for those who bled." Inside, the handwriting changes once more, swift, angular, devoid of ornamentation. These are military reports, the bureaucratic heartbeat of a war the Church never confessed. The title stamped at the top reads Congregatio de Nocturnis Hostibus, the congregation for the enemies of the night. The document begins bluntly. Not all demons are bound by exorcism. For those that wear flesh, faith must take form. From this principle were born the Vatican's hidden orders, small, clandestine brotherhoods bound by oaths of silence, trained in both theology and violence. The Codex lists their names, though most have been erased by later censors. The first, and perhaps the most infamous, was Ordo Sancti Longini, the Order of Saint Longinus, named for the soldier who pierced Christ's side. The archivist traces the letters carefully. They saw themselves as sanctified skeptics, he explains, men who wounded to reveal grace. The Order of Longinus was founded in the early 14th century under papal sanction, charged with containing corporeal blasphemies, entities that occupied the threshold between life and death. Each initiate was both priest and executioner, trained to administer last rites and fatal blows in the same breath. Their motto, Veritas per vulnera, truth through the wound. Their initiation ritual, detailed in a chilling appendix, involved standing alone in a crypt with an unmarked coffin for 3 nights, fasting, praying, and listening. Those who heard nothing were dismissed, those who heard whispers were ordained. The document notes dryly, of 10 candidates, 1 returns. The second order mentioned is Militia Lucis Obscuri, the militia of the shadowed light. Formed centuries later during the Counter-Reformation, they operated as both field investigators and archivists. Their task was not to kill, but to confirm, tracking rumors of vampiric infestations, cataloging patterns of death, and retrieving forbidden texts before they spread into heresy. They reported directly to the Congregation of the Holy Office, the Inquisition's spiritual intelligence branch. Their agents traveled as monks, merchants, even masons, hiding their mission behind the facade of piety or pilgrimage. The Codex records their protocols with unnerving precision. If a village reported unexplained deaths, a single monk was dispatched with the relics of Saint Anthony. He would bless the ground, interview the dying, and, if signs aligned, light a candle of black wax at the altar. If the flame bent toward the crucifix, the case was closed. If it bent away, he sent word to Rome using a ciphered psalm. Psalm 88, verse 12. "Shall your wonders be known in the dark?" That phrase was code for infestation. The archivist's expression tightens. "Even the scripture became camouflage," he murmurs. A marginal annotation written in red, likely by a later Vatican auditor, admits the uneasy truth. Their zeal often exceeded their discernment. Many innocent graves were opened, many restless nights created by the cure itself. The Codex proceeds to describe the most secret of all, the Custodes Umbrae, the keepers of the shadow. Unlike the militant orders, they fought not with weapons, but with knowledge. Their sole mission to maintain the archives, to ensure that the records of such entities and their encounters were preserved, hidden, and updated. The Custodes considered ignorance more dangerous than belief. Their leader held the title Praefectus Silentii, the prefect of silence. His task was to decide what the world should forget. The archivist looks up, his voice barely audible. "They were my predecessors." He runs a hand across the vellum, and a faint scent of wax and iron rises. They operated under one law, he continues. Nothing written is ever destroyed, only sealed. The Codex confirms this grim principle. Each time a vampire case was resolved, whether by death, exorcism, or containment, the documents were not burned but placed within lead-lined reliquaries, buried beneath consecrated floors. A prayer was spoken over the vault, not of closure, but of delay. Ut dormiant donec lumen revelatur. Let them sleep until the light reveals them. The archivist pauses here, his face half in shadow. We still say that, he admits, when we close a file that shouldn't exist. One final entry closes the section, a list of casualties, not of monsters, but of men, dozens of names, each followed by the same brief epitaph, mortuus in fide, dead in faith. Among them are priests, scholars, and lay brothers, their fates unknown, their bodies unrecovered. But beside one name, Frater Valerius, there is a rare annotation in gold, corpor non invento, spiritu liberato. Body not found, soul delivered. The archivist exhales slowly, and when he speaks again, his tone carries the weary reverence of a eulogy. They wrote that because they had to believe it, that when a man dies fighting something unspeakable, his soul doesn't vanish, it's escorted. He closes the ledger, but not before we see the very last phrase inscribed at the bottom of the parchment. We are not hunters of the night. We are custodians of dawn. He repeats it softly, as though it were both prayer and apology. That is the paradox of the Vatican's secret orders. They were never chasing darkness to destroy it. They were carrying light to places that didn't want it. The lamp's flame wavers, and the air between us feels charged, trembling with the residue of centuries. You see now, he says, why they hid this so deeply. If the Church ever admitted what it fought, it would have to admit what it learned from the fight. He lifts the lamp toward the shelves where sealed reliquaries gleam faintly in their lead cradles. They call them enemies of the night, he whispers. But every hunter who entered that darkness returned carrying a little of it. In that silence, the words of the Codex seem to hover like incense. Mortuus in fide, dead in faith. But perhaps the archivist muses that is the only kind of death that ever really conquers the night. Daylight convinces us that the old night is gone. Fluorescent bulbs make priests of electricity. Hospitals hum like secular chapels. Cameras stare until superstition blushes and looks away. Yet the Codex, stubborn as stone, insists that brightness is not the same as dawn. What men call modern, a late entry muses, is only light that has forgotten its shadow. The archivist opens a newer folio, the vellum paler, the margins wider, the Latin punctuated by typewritten inserts from a century that trusted machines more than relics. He does not smile. These are the files that pretend not to be files, he says. Memoranda, clinical notes, debriefs, the shape of doubt after it buys a wristwatch. The first fragment is a hospital report, translated into the Church's inward Latin, and then back again in clipped English, a cluster of unexplained anemias in a provincial city. Patients arrive pale, pressure low, hematocrit, falling without trauma or obvious bleed. They sleep poorly, dream worse, wake thirsty for water they do not drink. One nurse writes that she finds 2 faint marks on a woman's neck, too neat to be accident, too shy to be wound. A resident jokes about vampires, the consultant frowns, orders more tests, adds iron, subtracts sarcasm. The numbers improve for a day, then fall like a shadow over noon. The hospital chaplain visits the ward and reports the chapel candle in the corridor bends away from the crucifix. No stake, no grave. only a trend line that behaves like a parable. The Vatican receives a copy stapled to a note from a local bishop. I do not believe in such things, but I believe in patterns. The militia of the shadowed light, what remains of it, files the case as anomalous fatigue with liturgical response. The response is modest, a mass said, quietly, beside the on-call room, salt stitched through the seam of a windowsill, a rosary left to glow faintly in the locker of a night shift nurse. Within a week, the cluster dissolves as if the illness remembers another appointment. The official explanation reads, unknown environmental factor. The Codex writes a single line, quietus per misericordiam. The archivist turns the page. A parish inventory from a seaside town lists heat loss in sacristy despite intact seals, odor of iron and myrrh on non-fast days, a stray dog refusing to enter the nave. The maintenance crew replaces weather stripping. The temperature drops further. The priest spends the night in the sanctuary with a thermos of coffee and a tired courage. At 3 a.m, the flame of the sanctuary lamp elongates toward the door. The priest whispers the prayers of an exorcism he is not licensed to say and hears, very softly, what could be a sigh. In the morning, the door is rimed with salt he did not put there. He calls the chancery calls nobody. The Codex adds the parish name to a list titled Limina Tenuiora, thin thresholds. Cities have their own thresholds. A subway tunnel where the lights briefly dim in sequence like a traveling benediction. A stairwell that always tastes of pennies. An abandoned cinema whose mirrors tarnish exactly at dusk and clear at noon. A hotel elevator that stops between floors when a convent nearby keeps vigil for the dead. The archivist marks each with a fingernail as if the vellum were a map. We do not hunt these, he says. We accompany them until they pass. It is pastoral care for architecture, a church's overnight watch extended to public works and private neglect. Modern instruments enter the margins like nervous guests. Handheld meters that register fields no one taught in seminary, infrared cameras that draw pictures of cold, recorders that capture nothing except the sound of a breath that belongs to no one present. A young custos, keeper, notes in a side column that freshly consecrated salt shows a measurable change in conductivity when scattered along a sill in a room that smells faintly of ash. An older hand writes, "Burn the data with the candle. Keep the candle." Another replies, "Keep both. God can survive a graph." From time to time, the Codex allows itself a sentence that looks like a headline. Warehouse discovery in Lublin, 22 mattresses filled with foreign soil. The police chalk it up to smuggling. The bishop sends a letter that is not a letter, a prayer card bearing the psalm that closes thresholds. The soil, when tested, is rich in minerals not local to any map in the file. Its origin is listed as indeterminate. The mattresses are burned, their ashes mixed with holy water and poured into a river that does not remember. 2 weeks later, the river rises and floods a street known for bars that open until morning. No deaths. Every bottle in a certain cellar shatters inward, as if something exhaled. The priest calls the event a message. The civil engineer calls it hydrology. The Codex writes terra ligata solvitur. A page near the end of the folio bears an email printout, its font utilitarian, its greeting formal to the point of apology. A professor of comparative literature sends a note to a diocesan address about an undergraduate who has rewritten the same poem 7 times, each in a different language she does not speak. The poem is about a door. The door is a mouth. The mouth never closes. The chaplain meets the student who laughs kindly and shows no mark upon her skin. He asks her to read the poem aloud. Halfway through, he interrupts with the name of Christ. She blinks, apologizes for losing her place, starts again in another language, and this time the air in the office grows colder without permission. He tells her that sometimes people carry other people's grief, then gives her a rosary and a recipe for soup. For the next 9 nights, he prays beside her dormitory from a bench that pretends to be about smokers, not saints. The poem ceases to change languages. The student transfers to architecture. The professor sends another email that ends, "Thank you for nothing and everything." What does the church do with such things? It does not convene inquisitions. It convenes anniversaries. A community arranges a memorial mass for the unnamed dead who still want to be known. A hospital chaplain blesses a hallway. On the night the night shift laughs about it least. A cemetery caretaker, atheist by habit, scrupulous by trade, allows a retired nun to sprinkle salt into a grave that should not be warm. It is theatre, a skeptic says. It is therapy, a social worker says. It is liturgy, the codex says, and then adds, almost shyly, and it works. Every so often, a case refuses the soft hand. A basement shrine ringed with thrift store icons and photographs with the eyes scratched out. A squat where mattresses pucker with soil, not found in any nearby country. A charismatic preacher who has learned to peddle the warmth that follows the voice. The Vatican file grows stiff here, the pages greasier with handling. Teams are sent quietly. They unlock no cages and kick down no doors. They repair thresholds, speak names, carry away what must be sealed. We are janitors, one custos writes, of what is not supposed to be here. A line below in a different hand, custodians of dawn. It is the same phrase we saw in gold. Some mottos survive by changing jobs. A final leaf in the folio gives the lie to anyone who believes the church loves drama. It is a list of places and dates where nothing happened after prayers were said. Nothing is the boast. A school that stopped smelling like pennies. A home where a child finally slept. A stairwell where the echo went back to being an echo. The Codex blesses this boredom with a verse. Beati qui nihil vident et tamen requiescunt. Blessed are those who see nothing and yet find rest. We close the modern section without triumph. The archivist returns the folio to its sleeve as if laying a sleeping child back into a crib. Technology gives us more shadows to measure, he says, but the work does not change. Thresholds, names, patience, mercy thickens the air. He looks toward the staircase where a pale square of morning has begun to appear at the top, as if the day itself were a page we are about to turn. The old night, he says, has learned new ways to look ordinary. So we have learned new ways to watch without staring. On the table, the rosary of light we read about earlier lies coiled, a constellation waiting for a sky. The beads do not glow, they do not need to. Above us, Rome wakes to coffee and traffic, and the gentle arrogance of monuments. Below, the vault keeps its covenant with time, nothing erased, everything forgiven slowly. Modernity is only a longer candle, it still requires tending. As we leave, the archivist pats the folio once, a gesture somewhere between farewell and absolution. If you must ask whether they still exist, he says, ask the city's thin places. They answer more honestly than we do. The stair drinks our footsteps. The air warms. Somewhere behind us, a candle that should not have known our names continues to burn in the exact, steady way that hope prefers. By now, the air in the vault feels thinner, as if the old paper has consumed its own oxygen to keep itself alive. The archivist pauses at a locked compartment sealed in red wax. He breaks it gently, murmuring something in Latin that sounds less like a prayer and more like a warning. This, he says quietly. was the section they tried hardest to bury. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was persuasive. The parchment inside is older than the others, edges frayed, script uneven. Across the top of the first page, in trembling ink, is written De Sanguine Dei, on the blood of God. Beneath it, a line that reads, a speculation forbidden, yet inevitable. The text begins like an essay, not an accusation. It claims that the vampire, far from being a mere corruption of faith, is faith itself gone feral, an unintended byproduct of divine biology. If Christ's blood is eternal, the author writes, then what happens to the drop that falls outside the chalice? The archivist's tone deepens. This is the heresy that frightened the papacy most, he explains. The idea that the first vampire was born not of sin, but of the crucifixion. The author, whose name is deliberately erased with soot, begins by reinterpreting Scripture itself. In John's Gospel, when the soldier pierces the side of Christ, both blood and water flow. The Orthodox interpretation holds that this symbolized the sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. But this anonymous theologian asks something bolder. What if the blood did not all ascend? What if some remained? He suggests that the divine blood, spilled upon unblessed ground, could not decay, could not vanish, and thus began to remember. For life is in the blood, he writes, echoing Leviticus. If the blood of God touched the soil, it would awaken the soil, and the soil, not knowing prayer, would hunger instead. It is a chilling symmetry. The vampire in this heretical cosmology is not a mockery of resurrection, it is its shadow twin. When the tomb opened, not only life returned to life, but death learned to imitate it. Every miracle, the author claims, casts a residue. He writes of a lineage not traced through genealogy, but contagion of sanctity corrupted by exposure. Where the blood fell, he notes, earth quickened, but without obedience. It desired the warmth again, it learned to call to it. Those who buried their dead upon that ground were said to rise with a hunger, not for flesh, but for communion. The instinct of worship twisted into thirst. The Church censored this treatise brutally. Marginalia in crimson ink accuse its author of theological vampirism, a phrase unique in all Vatican records. Yet other scholars copied fragments in secret, their curiosity stronger than their obedience. One Dominican commentator, his own name later blotted out, writes in defense of the theory, if the vampire feeds on the living, it is because the divine blood once fed the dead. The archivist turns the page with care. Listen to this, he says. It sounds less like heresy and more like grief. If the Christ is truly Lord of both the living and the dead, then the vampire, the restless one, is not his enemy, but his echo, proof that redemption has spilled too wide to be contained. It is a horrifying tenderness, the idea that even damnation exists because grace overflowed. The Codex continues, blending theology with alchemy. It claims the first Vatican exorcists discovered traces of a substance on ancient relics that resisted decay, coagulated, crimson, but unidentifiable. They called it sanguis aeternus, eternal blood. It was neither alive nor dead, but vibrating between. Theorists proposed that exposure to such matter might reanimate flesh, unblessed by soul, creating not life, but parody. The Church ordered all samples sealed, buried, and catalogued in a vault, marked only with the symbol of the spear. The archivist's eyes narrow. The vault of Longinus, he whispers. I've seen the sigil. He points to a passage written in darker ink. They will call this heresy because it implies that Christ's passion was too generous. But the light that spills beyond the lamp is not evil. It simply belongs to night. A later censor, perhaps centuries afterward, adds a furious rebuttal in the margin. To suggest that evil arises from divine excess is to blaspheme the cross. Yet beneath it, another hand, fainter, resigned, adds, perhaps, or perhaps the cross bleeds further than we wish. The archivist reads on, his voice low. The treatise ends with a prophecy, or maybe a plea. When the Church forgets mercy and remembers only order, the blood will rise again. It will walk the earth in the shape of compassion denied. Those who called it monster will beg it for forgiveness. He closes the folio halfway, as if uncertain whether to continue. The Vatican never burned this, he says softly. They couldn't, because if it's true, if divine blood can awaken matter, then resurrection itself is contagious. He leans closer, his face caught between awe and unease. The heretical theory reframes everything. The vampire becomes the tragic twin of faith, the proof that God's power cannot be contained within salvation alone. But he touches the margin where the ink has bled through the parchment like dried blood. It means, he whispers, that even the night is holy, but it does not know how to stop hungering. The archivist seals the folio once more, pressing the wax shut with the symbol of the spear. His eyes remain fixed on the cooling red mark. That, he says finally, is why they keep this buried. Not because it is false, but because it is merciful. He exhales slowly, the words hanging like incense. If this is true, then the line between saint and vampire is only a matter of appetite. The lamp flickers. Somewhere above us, a choir rehearses faintly, the notes filtering down like dust in sunlight. The archivist listens until the sound fades. The song of the redeemed, he murmurs. And maybe the song of the restless. He looks toward the sealed door at the far end of the vault, the one marked with the spear of Longinus. And for the first time, his composure falters. You wanted to know why the Church never tells these stories, he says, because once you understand them, you stop fearing hell, you start fearing heaven. The archivist does not open another folio. Instead, he folds his hands as if holding a weight that isn't there. Around us, the air of the vault has changed, no longer cold, just still. The stillness of a candle just before it dies. The lamp trembles faintly, and the whisper of its flame feels almost alive, as though listening. This is the end of the record, he says. The pages beyond this point are blank, not from age, but by intention. The archivists who came before us believed that every mystery should have a silence wide enough for God to answer in his own time. He gestures toward the shelves of sealed codices, dark spines, wax sigils, bronze locks. Everything here, he continues, is both confession and denial. The Church wrote to remember, then sealed to forget, but the paradox is that remembering and forgetting are the same act. One sanctifies the other. That is why these archives still breathe. They are the lungs of faith. He sets the lamp down, and its halo pools between us. If you have listened carefully, he murmurs, you've noticed the pattern. The vampire begins as a monster, becomes a metaphor, and ends as a mirror. And the Church, terrified by what it sees, does what all believers eventually do. It kneels. He opens his own notebook, thin, modern, bound in soft leather. Its first page bears a single sentence, handwritten in English. Faith is the wound that does not kill us. That line isn't mine, he admits. It's copied from an unnamed monk who worked here in the 17th century. He said the purpose of the archives was never to protect truth, but to give truth a body to bleed in. Without blood, theology is speculation. With too much of it, it becomes horror. Somewhere between the two lies worship, he walks to the far end of the vault, to a small alcove most would miss, and places his hand on the wall. Behind this, he says softly, is the oldest reliquary in the collection. No one opens it anymore. They say it holds a piece of linen, stained not by martyrdom, but by something that bled without dying. We keep vigil, not to guard it, but to remind ourselves what mercy costs. For a long moment we stand there in silence. The weight of centuries presses close, and it feels as though the darkness itself is kneeling, waiting for permission to pray. The archivist finally turns back, his voice quiet, almost tender. The Vatican never fought a war against the undead, he says. It fought a war against despair, because if even the damned can still hunger for grace, then damnation itself is only an unfinished prayer. He returns to the table and begins to extinguish the lamps one by one. Each flame sighs before surrendering, a small, reluctant death. Between the extinguishings, his voice threads through the dark. We tell these stories so the soul remembers its boundaries. But sometimes, he adds, God writes beyond the margins. The last lamp goes out, and for a heartbeat, the room is perfect black. Then a single sound, the echo of his footsteps on marble, reminds the darkness that it has been named. We ascend together, climbing the spiral staircase that leads back toward the faint promise of morning. The stones are cool beneath our touch, the air thinning with every turn. Halfway up, the archivist stops and looks down the stairwell. The faint light below outlines his profile like an icon burned into shadow. Every archivist, he says, asks the same question in the end. Do we keep these things to protect the world from their truth, or to protect the truth from the world? He does not wait for an answer. At the surface, dawn has begun its quiet work. The marble of St. Peter's gleams, blinding after the vault's patience. Bells stir the city awake. Tourists will arrive soon, unaware that beneath their feet, a library dreams of blood and mercy. The archivist stands by the gate. His robes, now visible in the new light, are simple, grey, without insignia. If you tell anyone what you've seen, he says, they won't believe you, that's all right. Faith never needed witnesses, only echoes. He presses a small object into your hand, a bead from a broken rosary, smooth from centuries of fingers. For remembrance, he says. It won't protect you, but it will remind you that protection isn't the point. You ask him whether the Vatican still keeps records of the undead. He smiles faintly. Not in ink, he answers. Only in prayers. And with that, he walks away, disappearing into the cathedral's widening light, leaving behind only the echo of a sentence that sounds half liturgical, half human. No darkness devours the truth, but truth without mercy is a wound that never closes. Somewhere beneath, in the silence of sealed stone, the archives remain, a kingdom of unburied words waiting for the next hand to tremble open their secrets. And perhaps, in that patient dark, a single line continues to breathe. Blood is prayer.